A blind Navy SEAL adopted a dying German Shepherd. Then the dog uncovered his family's darkest secret. The vet's hand was on the syringe when the dog moved. Not a lunge, not a bark. Shadow pressed himself flat against the stainless steel exam table, all 91 pounds of him, and laid his chin on the arm of the man beside him, the one sitting in the chair with his eyes that didn't work anymore, and held it there. He had survived 2 eyed blasts, 4 combat deployments, and a bullet that had clipped the edge of his right hip. He had survived all of that. And now, at 9 years old, with a mass in his chest and lungs that couldn't hold air the way they used to, he had 1 hour left, and he spent it asking, in the only language he had, for 5 more minutes. The vet set the syringe down. Ethan Cole, 38, former Chief Petty Officer, SEAL Team 6, sat perfectly still in the plastic chair beside the exam table and said nothing. His eyes were behind dark glasses, the way they always were, not vanity, not affectation, but a courtesy to strangers who found it easier to talk to him when they weren't looking into irises that had been damaged by the blast that ended his career. His right hand was in Shadow's fur. He had not decided to put it there. It had simply gone there, the way it always went there, without instruction. "We have time," the vet said quietly. "A little. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please stay with us until the very end. What happens next is something we believe you'll carry with you long after it's over." Ethan Cole had been blind for 22 months. Partial blindness was the clinical term, 60% loss in the right eye, full loss in the left. Residual light sensitivity on both sides that made bright rooms feel like standing too close to a flashbulb. He navigated by the things that didn't require sight. The weight of the air in a room, the sound that floors made under different feet, the way conversations changed when someone was lying. He had developed these capacities before the blast, because 17 years as a Navy SEAL had made attention to detail a survival skill long before his eyes stopped cooperating. He had simply redirected the attention. He was 6 feet even, broad through the chest in the way that men who have trained their entire adult lives carry themselves, not bulky, but dense, like the weight was distributed evenly and had nowhere particular to go. His hair was dark brown, cut close. His jaw held a week of stubble that he managed by feel with a straight razor, because that was how he'd always done it, and he saw no reason to change. His eyes, behind the dark lenses, were a deep, quiet gray, still and patient. The kind of eyes that had learned to absorb things without showing what the absorption cost. He had spent the better part of his career in places most people only saw on the news: Kandahar, Mosul, the federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan, on a deployment that carried no official name, and he had come back from all of them with 2 Bronze Stars, a Navy Cross he kept in a drawer, and a relationship with silence that other people sometimes found uncomfortable. He was not unfriendly. He was not remote. He had simply, over 17 years and 4 combat deployments, become a man who understood that most situations benefited from patience rather than force, and that the ones that didn't were obvious enough that they required no announcement. He was capable of considerable more than he showed. He had learned that showing it was rarely the right first move. Shadow was a 9-year-old German Shepherd and former military working dog, MEMW certification W479, 7 years active service with the Naval Special Warfare Command before the hip injury that ended his operational deployment. His coat was the deep black and sable of a working line shepherd, darkening along the ridge of his spine and the points of his ears. He weighed 91 pounds. His right hip had a small indentation where the bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone, a wound that left him with the faintest hesitation in his right rear stride, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, and Ethan always knew to look. On his left ear, a long pale scar ran from the base to the tip, where a fragment had caught him in 2019, and it had healed clean and silvery, a mark that other dogs at the dog park never had, and that children sometimes reached up to touch with a reverence they couldn't explain. Ethan had fought the military adoption process for 14 months. He'd made 11 phone calls, filled out 4 separate form packets, engaged a veterans advocacy organization, and written 2 letters to his congressman. He wasn't Shadow's original handler. That man had been killed in Mosul in 2018. But Ethan had worked alongside Shadow on the last 2 deployments. And when Shadow was facing placement with strangers at 11 years old, or euthanasia for the hip injury that had healed imperfectly but completely, Ethan had decided that neither of those outcomes was acceptable. Shadow had been cleared for adoption 2 months before the blast. By the time Ethan could leave the medical facility in San Diego and drive to pick him up, he had been blind for 3 weeks. He had driven to the kennel. He hadn't told anyone he was driving. Shadow had walked out of the kennel run and found Ethan's hand in the dark without being guided to it. That had been 22 months ago. They had not been separated since. The town of Harlan, Montana was the kind of small that people from cities always described as peaceful, and that people who lived there knew was just another word for everyone knowing everything and nobody saying most of it. Population 1,400. A main street with a hardware store. A diner called Eileen's that had been there since 1961. A VFW hall that held bingo on Wednesday nights and served as the de facto community center for the veterans who lived within 30 miles. The surrounding country was high and cold and beautiful in the way that Montana is beautiful when you're not fighting it. Rolling grassland giving way to mountain foothills, big sky above everything. The light in October coming in low and golden and honest. The air tasted of pine resin and coming cold. Ethan could hear the wind before it hit. He'd been in Harlan for 4 months, living in the house his mother had grown up in, a white-frame farmhouse on 16 acres, left to her by her parents and held through 3 decades of hard winters, and a husband who had left in 1994 and never provided much either before or after that. His mother, Lillian Cole, was 67 years old and had been nearly blind herself since a macular degeneration diagnosis 3 years prior, which was a fact that carried its own particular weight between them. 2 blind people in the same house, neither of whom had been the kind of person to ask for help, learning to navigate together. It was not always easy. It was never lonely. Ethan's older brother, Garrett Cole, was 42 years old and lived in Billings, 212 miles away, which was close enough to drive in 3 hours and far enough to justify not making the drive very often. Garrett had not served. He had done 2 years of community college, worked in insurance sales for 6 years, failed, then found his way into property management through a contact he'd made at a country club he couldn't afford to belong to, but attended on guest passes when someone else was paying. He had a way of talking about money that suggested he thought about it constantly, and a way of talking about family that suggested he thought about it considerably less. He visited Harlan 4 times a year, always at moments that Ethan had come to realize, in the rearranging of memory that blindness had accelerated, corresponded with things he should have connected earlier. The January visit after Lillian's diagnosis. The April visit when her financial power of attorney had been restructured. The August visit that had coincided, by some calendrical coincidence that no longer seemed like coincidence, with the transfer of Lillian's primary checking account to a joint account that Garrett now managed to help with the bills. Garrett was not loud about his arrogance. That was what made him effective. He spoke in reasonable tones. He used words like stewardship and convenience and just making sure she's taken care of. He had, over the course of 22 months, exactly the same 22 months that Ethan had been learning to be blind, quietly repositioned himself as the responsible sibling, the one who handled the finances, the one who understood what their mother needed, in contrast to the brother who had come home broken from a war and needed care himself. He had told Lillian twice that Ethan's presence in the house was a burden on her. He had said it gently. He always said things gently. What Garrett Cole had actually done over 22 months was transfer a total of $61,000 from Lillian's retirement accounts and veteran spousal benefits their father had served, briefly before his departure, into a private account in Garrett's name and Billings. He had done this in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flags. He had done this while calling his mother every Sunday and asking how she was feeling. He had never imagined his brother would move back to Harlan. He had never imagined that the dog would notice. Shadow noticed on a Wednesday. Garrett had arrived that morning for one of his visits, announced the previous evening with a phone call that Ethan had taken on the kitchen landline while Shadow sat at his feet and listened. The dog always listened when Garrett called. He sat closer than usual. His ears tracked the sound coming from the handset with a precision and stillness that Ethan had filed and not yet opened. Garrett came through the front door at 11 a.m. with a bag of groceries he hadn't been asked to bring and a set of financial documents he'd had printed at a Billings office supply store that morning. He sat down at the kitchen table with Lillian and spread the documents in front of her with the specific care of a man presenting something to someone who cannot fully see what they are signing. Shadow, who was lying against the far wall of the kitchen, stood up. He didn't cross the room. He didn't growl. He stood fully upright and watched Garrett Cole with his amber eyes and with an absolute unmoving stillness that was not calm, it was its opposite, concentrated into a point. His hackles rose along his spine like a ridgeline. His tail was low and motionless. Ethan was at the counter. He couldn't see the documents. He couldn't see his brother's hands. But he could hear Shadow breathe, and Shadow had stopped breathing the way he breathed when things were normal. "What are you having her sign?" Ethan said. "Just a routine update to the financial authorization," Garrett said. His voice stayed level. This was the thing about Garrett. His voice always stayed level. "The bank requires it annually. It's standard." "Read it to me," Ethan said. A pause. The length of the pause said something. "Ethan, you don't need to. Read it to me, Garrett." Shadow walked to the table and stood at Lillian's side, close enough that his shoulder pressed against her knee, and he did not move from that position. Garrett read the first paragraph. He skipped the second. Ethan knew he'd skipped it because Garrett had a habit of increasing his pace through information he didn't want attention paid to, which was a pattern Ethan had learned to hear the same way he'd once learned to hear detonation timers. The change in rhythm was the warning. "Stop," Ethan said. "What does paragraph 2 say?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the October wind moved through the grass. He didn't ask again. He went to the bedroom where he kept his work, the space where he'd been rebuilding his life since San Diego. The filing system in the top drawer, organized by touch and by position. With rubber band markers he'd developed to distinguish folders. He found the folder he'd been compiling for the past 3 weeks, the one he'd started building after the afternoon Shadow had led him, with patient and specific purpose, across the living room floor to the corner of the couch, where a folder had slipped between the cushion and the frame. A folder full of bank statements in Garrett's handwriting that bore account numbers Ethan had never seen before and a series of transfer dates that, when he had them read aloud to him by a text-to-speech application, told a story he had not wanted to believe and could no longer choose not to. Shadow had found that folder. He hadn't knocked it loose by accident. He had placed himself at that corner of the couch, with the deliberateness of a dog communicating something to the only person in the house who would understand what he was showing him. He'd sat there for 4 minutes while Ethan worked at the desk across the room, and then he'd pressed his nose into the gap and pushed until the folder fell. And then he'd looked at Ethan. Ethan hadn't been able to see him looking. He'd heard the soft thud and the weight of the attention behind it, and gone to find out what the dog had decided he needed to know. The folder had told him the rest. He'd spent the next 3 weeks gathering what he needed. He'd called 2 contacts, a veterans advocacy attorney named Patricia Wash in Helena, who had handled financial exploitation cases, and a former SEAL teammate named Roark Dillon, who'd retired into forensic accounting, and who had walked Ethan through what the documents showed in a 40-minute phone call that Ethan had listened to in complete silence before saying thank you and hanging up. The total was $61,430, 22 months. Exactly the amount of time Ethan had been blind. He came back to the kitchen with the folder. "Sit down," Ethan said. His voice was the voice he'd used in Kandahar and Mosul, and the place that didn't have an official name, not loud, not angry. Precise in the way that precision is more frightening than volume, because it implies that every word has been chosen, and none of them is going to be walked back. Garrett looked at the folder. His face shifted through several things. He landed on the one he'd practiced longest, reasonable concern. "Ethan, whatever you think you've found, I'm not asking for your explanation," Ethan said. "I'm telling you what happens next." Shadow stood between his brother and his mother, with his body angled and his eyes on Garrett, and the absolute stillness of an animal that has made a full assessment and reached a conclusion. Ethan set the folder on the table. "Patricia Wash, from the Veterans Family Advocacy Center in Helena, has reviewed these documents. She's filed a formal complaint with Montana Adult Protective Services. A forensic review of the accounts has been initiated by her office and confirmed by a second review. The total documented amount is $61,430, taken over 22 months. He paused. "2 investigators from the Harlan County Sheriff's Office are in our driveway." He had not raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. Garrett looked at the window. He looked at the folder. He looked at Shadow, who had not moved. "You can't," he started. "I'm not asking you," Ethan said. "I'm telling you." The kitchen door opened. A deputy named Vickers came in. A man Ethan had met twice since moving to Harlan, once at the VFW, and once when he'd helped carry a fence post for a neighbor's property line repair, and behind him, a second officer. They were not quiet about their arrival. They were not supposed to be. "Garrett Cole?" Vickers said. Garrett Cole stood at the kitchen table with his financial documents in front of him, and his groceries on the counter, and the full weight of 22 months of small decisions, bearing down through the floor of a farmhouse he had come to 48 times in the years since their father left, telling himself each time that what he was doing was something his mother wouldn't miss, and his brother couldn't see. He looked at Ethan. Ethan did not say anything. He didn't need to. Shadow sat down beside Lillian Cole and pressed his large dark head against her knee and held it there, and she put her hand in his fur without looking, the way you reach for something you trust, and she held on. Garrett Cole was handcuffed in the kitchen of the farmhouse where he had grown up, in front of the mother he had taken from, and the brother he had underestimated, and he was escorted to a county vehicle on a gravel driveway in Harlan, Montana, while the October wind moved through the high grass, and the sky was the particular blue that only exists in that country at that time of year, wide and cold and indifferent to all of it. Nobody outside the house knew what had happened yet. By the end of the week they would. In Harlan, everyone knew everything. Eventually, 8 months later, Lillian Cole was sitting on the front porch of the farmhouse in the early evening of a June day that had decided to be warm and generous with its light. She had a cup of tea. She could not see the color of the fields, but she could feel the warmth of the last of the sun on her face, and she could hear, somewhere across the 16 acres, the sound of Shadow running. He ran differently now. Not the careful, hip-managed gait of a dog conserving what a wound had taken. He ran with the loose, full-body joy of a dog who has been told that the season he is in does not require him to be careful anymore. He had responded to the medication with a stubbornness that the vet described as medically improbable, and that Ethan privately attributed to the dog having made a decision about how much time was enough and revising his estimate upward. Garrett Cole had been charged with felony theft and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. He had pled guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for full restitution and cooperation with the forensic review, which had expanded to identify 2 other family members he had quietly exploited over the previous decade, in the same methodical, gentle, level-voiced way. His plea carried a mandatory restitution order, 5 years of supervised probation, and the loss of his property management licenses in Montana and Wyoming. His contact information had been removed from his mother's accounts, her medical records, and her front door. Patricia Wash's office had recovered $61,430. Every dollar. Lillian had the money in an account that only she and Ethan could access, managed by a trust officer at the Harlan Branch Bank who called her by her first name and drove out to the house twice a year to review the statements in person. She did not need much. She had what she needed. Ethan was in the field with the fence line. He was rebuilding a section of the west boundary that had been left to rot for 15 years. Working by feel along the wire and posts, his hands remembering the geometry of the work the way hands remember all the things they have done often enough. He was not thinking about anything in particular. That was the thing about fence work. It gave your hands something to do and your mind permission to go quiet, which was a permission he had not often granted himself and was learning, slowly, to take. Shadow came back across the field at a run and hit the fence line with a full-body turn and sat beside Ethan's knee, breathing hard, enormously pleased with himself for no reason that Ethan could identify and no reason he needed to. He put his hand in the dog's fur. "Good," he said. Shadow's tail swept the grass. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder. Sometimes they arrive as a dog who sits by a couch corner for 4 minutes, waiting for the right person to notice that something has been left where no one was supposed to find it. Sometimes God does not remove the darkness. He places beside us, in the seasons when we cannot see clearly, a loyalty so complete and so ancient that human language has never quite been adequate to describe it. The bond between a warrior and his dog is not a convenience. It is not a comfort. It is a covenant, as old as the first fire, as faithful as the last breath. It says, "I will notice what you cannot see. I will stay when staying costs something. I will not leave you to face the worst of it alone." We pass moments like Ethan's more often than we admit, someone in our family who is slowly being taken from. A truth we have been offered and declined to look at. A loyalty that has been waiting for us to be still enough to receive it. The question this story asks is simple, and it is personal, and only you can answer it. What is the thing you have not yet looked at? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to know that justice still finds its way to the right door. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and if you have ever known a dog who seemed to understand something nobody else could see, we want to hear about it. Your story might be the encouragement someone else needs today. If you believe in stories of courage, loyalty, and the faithfulness of God working through 4-legged companions and broken men who refuse to stop caring, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. May God bless you, protect your family, and guide you safely through whatever season of life you are walking through tonight. And may He send you, in the moments when you cannot see clearly, a loyalty that knows the way home.